If Jesus was crucified April 3rd, AD 33, then today, in the year 2026, March 29th, aligns with the first Palm Sunday, 1993 years ago. So what is Holy Week? What makes it important to Christians? We're going to answer these questions on today's episode. Welcome to the Mamapologist. This is a safe place for your doubts. Here, apologetics meets discipleship. Join me as we learn to think biblically about how to walk through this life as believers, struggling with tough questions, seeking hope, and finding answers together. So, what is Holy Week? Well, it's the week that begins with Palm Sunday, which was Jesus' entry into Jerusalem and ends with his crucifixion and resurrection. So let's talk about why this week is so important for Christian believers. Prophecy shows us that Jesus didn't accidentally become the Messiah. He fulfilled a plan that was in the making from the very beginning. We tend to think about Jesus arriving on the scene in the Gospels, the start of the New Testament. But the more I've read and studied the Bible, the more I see Jesus on every page. He is present throughout the Old Testament. In fact, when Jesus walked along the road to Emmaus with a couple of his followers, he spoke to them about how the whole story, from beginning to end, points to him. Luke 24:27, and beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them in all the scriptures the things concerning himself. The whole Bible points to Jesus. We talked about this a little bit in some of the episodes about Christmas and how Jesus was the Messiah. But the events of Holy Week point to him being the Messiah even more strongly than the events of his birth. So we're going to talk about that today, but we're going to start with the Passover, because the Passover is the event in Egypt when the Israelites are enslaved by the Pharaoh and Moses has come to free them. There's all these plagues ending with the 10th plague. The 10th plague is going to be the death of the firstborn son. And God tells the Israelites, in order for the angel of death to pass over your household, you need to follow these directions. And there's a passage in Exodus 12 that explains exactly what the Israelites were supposed to do. And it involves slaughtering a blemishless lamb and painting the lintel and the doorposts of their home using a hyssop branch with the blood of the lamb. And then the angel of death would pass over that home. And that points to Christ being the spotless lamb, and his blood being what would cover all of us so that death will not touch us. Some of the prophecies in that Passover passage are Exodus 12:5, that there would be a spotless lamb. And that's fulfilled in 1 Peter 1:19. There'd be no bones broken, Exodus 12:46. And that's fulfilled in John 19, verses 33 and 36. Slain at twilight, Exodus 12:6. Jesus died at exactly the time the priests were sacrificing the lambs for the Passover remembrance. See, from the time of Egypt to the time of Jesus, the Passover had been a remembrance, reminding Israel what God had done to protect them and pointing to the Messiah that was to come. Once Jesus came, Jesus becomes our Passover lamb, which is why his death at twilight is so significant. The blood being applied to the doorposts in verse 7. Romans 5:9 says we were justified by his blood. The hyssop branch used in Exodus 12:22 to paint the blood on the doorposts. In John 19:29, Jesus is offered sour wine on a hyssop branch. The wine and blood connection, which is comparable to the Last Supper. So judgment passes over those who are covered by the blood. They were supposed to eat the lamb with unleavened bread. Unleavened bread meant there was no sin or decay. And that was symbolic of the fact that Jesus had no sin. The timing of Jesus' arrival in the world, it was significant. Daniel 9, verses 24 through 26 says, 70 weeks are decreed about your people in your holy city to finish the transgression, to put an end to sin, to atone for iniquity, and bring in everlasting righteousness. And after the 62 weeks, an anointed one shall be cut off and shall have nothing. And the people of the prince who is to come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. And that was an abridged part of that passage, but it talks about the 62 weeks and the 70 weeks. Basically, they were prophesying that the Messiah is going to arrive before the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, which occurs in AD 70. So we have a window. The prophecy was made in about 538 BC. So we have a window that the Messiah is going to arrive within this time period. But that window actually starts at a specific point. So we talk about these weeks, and they're really interpreted as weeks of years. So we say 69 weeks times 7 years. That equals 483 years. Now, if we start at the decree to rebuild Jerusalem by Artaxerxes in around 445, 444 BC, we add 483 years using the Hebrew lunar calendar. That's going to get us to around 30 to 33 AD, which is exactly when we think that Jesus comes into Jerusalem and is the time period of his public ministry. So Jesus fulfills that prophecy by arriving at that time period. And he starts his arrival officially as the Messiah with his entrance into Jerusalem on Palm Sunday. Now we call it Palm Sunday because people cut branches from the trees and spread them on the road. They were likely palm branches. They were placed on the path as Jesus entered the city. Now this was prophesied in Zechariah 9:9. Behold, your king is coming to you, humble and mounted on a donkey. It is fulfilled in Matthew 21, verses 6 through 9. Jesus enters Jerusalem on a donkey, and crowds shout, Hosanna. Riding on a donkey is obviously a fulfillment of the prophecy in Zechariah, which is one of the prophecies that Jesus could have intentionally chosen to fulfill. But it's still meaningful. Most kings would ride in on a very distinguished horse or some other distinguished or noble manner of entering the city. Instead, Jesus chooses a humble path, a simple path. While he does draw attention to himself, he rides in on a donkey, which symbolizes peace, as opposed to a horse, which might symbolize war, which is important because Jesus' first coming, he comes as a peaceful person to bring the news of salvation, to bring the gospel message. When he comes again, he will come to bring justice. So that's an important fulfillment of prophecy. Now, the first day of the Holy Week following Palm Sunday was at the temple. Now, the prophecy was in Malachi 3, verses 1 through 3. The Lord will suddenly come to his temple like a refiner's fire. And that's a paraphrase of that passage. And that's fulfilled when Jesus enters the temple in Matthew 21 and drives out the money changers. Those who sold and bought in the temple overturned the tables and said to them, it is written, my house shall be called a house of prayer, but you have made it a den of robbers. So the prophecy in Malachi of the Messiah coming into the temple and refining it, removing the impurities, is fulfilled in that passage. On Tuesday, the religious leaders question Jesus and begin to plot against him in earnest. I mean, they've pretty much been plotting against him since he started doing miracles and confronting them about their sin. But this week, they start to get serious. The prophecy in Isaiah 53:3, he was despised and rejected by men, is fulfilled in Mark chapters 11 through 14, where we see these religious leaders, the Pharisees, deliberately seeking a way to destroy Jesus and have him killed. On Wednesday, Judas decides he's going to betray Jesus. Thursday is the Last Supper and the actual betrayal. And this is where Jesus eats the Passover meal. And we see the elements of the first Passover in Exodus 12 mirrored in the Last Supper, except there's no lamb because Jesus was the Passover lamb. So I think that's interesting. We see the betrayal prophesied in Psalm 41:9. Even my close friend has lifted his heel against me. That's fulfilled in Luke 22, verses 48 through 47. Specifically, we see that there were a couple of different elements of that betrayal. One of them was going to be that he was going to be paid 30 pieces of silver. Now, that prophecy was in Zechariah 11, 12 through 13. And they weighed out as my wages 30 pieces of silver. Then the Lord said to me, throw it to the potter, the lordly price at which I was priced by them. So I took the 30 pieces of silver and threw them into the house of the Lord to the potter. The fulfillment of that prophecy is in Matthew 26, verses 14 and 15. Then one of the 12, whose name was Judas Iscariot, went to the chief priests and said, what will you give me if I deliver him over to you? And they paid him 30 pieces of silver. Now, part of the original prophecy was that the money would be thrown into the temple and to the potter. That fulfillment comes in Matthew 27, verses 5 through 7. And throwing down the pieces of silver into the temple, he departed. And he went and hanged himself. But the chief priests, taking the pieces of silver, said, it is not lawful to put them in the treasury, since it is blood money. So they took counsel and bought with them the potter's field as a burial place for strangers. So we see it was predicted that Jesus would be betrayed by a close friend for 30 pieces of silver. The silver would be thrown into the temple and given to the potter. And all of these things were fulfilled. The last weekday is Good Friday, and that's the trial and the crucifixion. One of the prophecies about the trial was that he'd be silent before his accusers. Isaiah 53:7. He was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. Like a lamb that is led to the slaughter, and like a sheep before its shearers is silent, so he opened not his mouth. That is fulfilled in Matthew 27, verses 12 through 14. But when he was accused by the chief priests and elders, he gave no answer. Then Pilate said to him, do you not hear how many things they testify against you? But he gave him no answer, not even to a single charge, so that the governor was greatly amazed. Now there were several prophecies about the crucifixion that Jesus also fulfilled. First, that he would be mocked. Psalm 22, verses 7 through 8. All who see me mock me. They make mouths at me. They wag their heads. That is fulfilled in Matthew 27, verses 39 through 43. And those who passed by derided him, wagging their heads and saying, you who would destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days, save yourself if you're the Son of God. Come down from the cross. So also the chief priests with the scribes and elders mocked him, saying, he saved others. He can't save himself. And the passage continues to mock Jesus, calling him the King of Israel and the Son of God. Even the robbers being crucified with him reviled him and mocked him. So that element of the crucifixion is one of the prophecies that Jesus couldn't have controlled. He couldn't force people to mock him the way that they did. When even the robbers on both sides of him joined in as they hung dying, being crucified just as he was. Can I interrupt and ask you for a favor? If you're enjoying the podcast, please like, follow, subscribe, and leave a review. It helps to get the truth in front of more people who need to be encouraged that we have good reasons for what we believe. Thank you. Another prophecy was the piercing of the hands and feet. Psalm 22:16. For dogs encompass me, a company of evildoers encircles me. They have pierced my hands and feet. John 20:25 through 27 is the fulfillment when Thomas is speaking about Jesus having been resurrected. He mentions the piercings in his hands and feet. He says, "Unless I see in his hands the mark of the nails, and place my finger into the mark of the nails, and place my hand into his side, I will never believe." So this passage shows that Jesus was pierced through his hands because Thomas is mentioning it and saying, "I will not believe that he's risen from the dead unless I see that and touch him for myself." Another prophecy that Jesus fulfilled during the crucifixion was casting lots for his clothes. In Psalm 22, verse 18, "They divide my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots." That's fulfilled in John 19, verses 23 and 24. When the soldiers had crucified Jesus, they took his garments and divided them into 4 parts, 1 part for each soldier, also his tunic. He was also given sour wine, which was prophesied in Psalm 69, verse 21. "They gave me poison for food, and for my thirst they gave me sour wine to drink." We see the fulfillment of that in John 19, verses 28 through 30. A jar full of sour wine stood there. So they put a sponge full of the sour wine on a hyssop branch and held it to his mouth. Now, we mentioned that before when we talked about the Passover and the parallelism there of the hyssop branch being covered in the wine, much like the original Passover where it was covered in the lamb's blood and painted over the doorposts. Now, Matthew 27, verses 46 through 48 are really important. It says, "And about the 9th hour, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, saying, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani? That is, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And some of the bystanders hearing it said, "This man's calling Elijah." And one of them at once ran and put a sponge, filling it with sour wine, and put it on a reed and gave it to him to drink. Now, this passage is important because Jesus was intentionally quoting Psalm 22, which is where several of these prophetic passages have come from. He was trying to bring this passage to people's minds because he was saying, "I am the Messiah." He was quoting that psalm intentionally because he wanted them to remember. Most of the men, at least in the group, would have had that psalm memorized or been extremely familiar with it. So even just saying the first line would have caused them to bring to remembrance all of the psalm, and all of these prophecies that we've mentioned that were in Psalm 22 would have immediately popped into their minds, and they would have recognized that he was the Messiah. We also see that there were no broken bones, which is also part of the prophecy. In Exodus, it was an instruction that they should not break any of the lamb's bones. In Psalm 34:20, he keeps all his bones, not one of them is broken. And in John 19:33, "But when they came to Jesus and saw that he was already dead, they did not break his legs." Because he died so quickly, they didn't need to break his legs, thus fulfilling the prophecy. Now, this isn't something that Jesus could have controlled. How fast he died wasn't necessarily under his control. Because he was already dead, they didn't break his legs, but instead they pierced his side, which was prophesied in Zechariah 12:10. "And I will pour out on the house of David and the inhabitants of Jerusalem a spirit of grace and pleas for mercy, so that when they look on me, on whom they have pierced, they shall mourn for him." John 19, verse 34 says, "But one of the soldiers pierced his side with a spear, and at once there came out blood and water." So his bones were not broken, and his side was pierced. But there's more prophecy that he would be buried with the rich. In Isaiah 53, verse 9, it says, "And they made his grave with the wicked, and with a rich man in his death, though he had done no violence, and there was no deceit in his mouth." Now, the passage that fulfills that is Matthew 27, verses 57 through 60, where Joseph of Arimathea asks for the body of Jesus and took the body, wrapped it in clean linen shroud, and laid it in his own new tomb. Following the crucifixion is Passover, and it's Sabbath. So it is a silent day. It is a day of somber reflection for all of the Israelites. but it's a day of deep mourning for the disciples. The tomb is made secure. In Matthew 27:62 through 66, the disciples are grieving. They're hiding, and they don't know what is coming. The next day is the Resurrection Sunday. Now, the prophecy, Jesus made several statements that he would rebuild the temple in 3 days, that the sign of Jonah would be coming, which is the 3 days in the fish and then back to life. So those are some of the prophecies, and we see more in Psalm 16, you will not abandon my soul to Sheol, or Isaiah 53, verses 10 through 11, he will see his offspring and prolong his days. The fulfillment was in Matthew 28, he is not here, for he is risen. All of these prophecies are fulfilled in 1 week in the life of Jesus. They weren't written after the fact. Exodus 12 was written around 1400 to 1200 BC. Psalm 22 was written about 1,000 years before Jesus and 700 years before crucifixion existed, and yet depicts it very clearly. Isaiah 53 was written around 700 BC. Psalm 69 and 34 were written about 1,000 BC. And Zechariah 12 was written 520 to 480 BC. So the closest gap was 500 years before Jesus was crucified. All of these events had been prophesied. At what point does coincidence stop being a reasonable explanation? We see the Roman execution method predicted over 1,000 years before the events took place, 700 years before it even existed. We see the behavior of the soldiers, the mocking, the casting lots for his clothes. We see the crowd reacting, again, mocking, calling names. The details of his burial, being killed with the wicked, but buried with a rich man. Now, Jesus could have chosen to fulfill some of these prophecies by being silent, riding the donkey, but he couldn't have controlled his method of execution. He couldn't have controlled them casting lots for his clothes, dying quickly enough that they didn't break his legs, piercing his side, or them mocking him. And it makes you wonder, the exact fulfillment of so many of these prophecies in the window that Daniel predicts is either one heck of a coincidence or it's a holy plan of redemption. I hope you'll take some time this week to really investigate these claims. Could Jesus be who he said he is? Could he really be the Messiah? Could he be God who became flesh and died a torturous death on the cross in order to pay the penalty for your sins because of his great love for you? Could this be the plan that God had in place from the very beginning, that we see in the very first pages of Genesis, that God's plan of redemption was always the cross? I hope you'll take some time to consider that evidence. I think the evidence is there. Now, it may not be enough to silence every skeptic, but it's enough to make a reasonable conclusion that Jesus is who he says he is. Have a blessed Holy Week. Until next time, keep seeking truth, hold fast to faith, never be afraid to ask the tough questions, because God has answers.